Well, joining us now from Israel, the Israeli government spokesman Mark Regev, who is in Jerusalem. Mark Regev, does Israel accept that it's been using phosphorus bombs, flashettes and fragmentation bombs?
As your own reporter said, Israel only uses weapons that are acceptable in NATO forces, that are acceptable weapons used by other Western nations, democratic nations. We use no weapons whatsoever that are illegal under international convention or under international law.
These weapons are not illegal under international law, but it is illegal to use them in civilian areas.
And that's your allegation.
Do you accept that you have been using them in civilian areas?
Well, we're currently conducting our own internal investigation because of these sort of allegations. But I think it has to be said, the sort of report that we've just seen is methodologically very flawed. Ultimately, the fact that there was a combat zone, that there was fire, that the people were living, unfortunately, in a military zone where Hamas had turned civilian neighborhoods into places where they store weapons and explosives, where there were difficult firefights. It was almost by your report that Israel went in randomly and killed civilians. That's clearly not the case.
The problem is that you have a 24-mile-long strip in which 1.5 million people live, and you, by your own word, have been throwing phosphorus and flashette and fragmentation bombs into this area, not illegal under international law, but nevertheless illegal to be put into civilian areas, and you knew them to be civilian.
First of all, we're investigating because we take such allegations extremely seriously. But let's be clear here. You have to be very careful because Hamas controls the Gaza Strip, unfortunately, but they do. And when a reporter comes in, even a very good reporter from Channel 4, everyone he speaks to, afterwards when Channel 4 leaves, Hamas is still there. And for someone to say, well, the Israelis targeted my house because Hamas was shooting rockets from it, or in my basement Hamas had forcibly... I mean, to be fair, sir, it's very difficult for anyone to get true information where Hamas has this regime based on internal terror. You know,
Mr. Regev,
since the war is over, there are numerous reports of Hamas shooting people who have been talking out of line, of shooting in the leg political dissidents and so forth. It really is a regime of terror.
With respect, Mark Regev, you can say how much you like about how many people have been shot by Hamas. I'm afraid these are injuries that have been shown to us by the people who have suffered them. They can't make them up, and they can't be forced to reveal them by Hamas. They showed them to our cameraman and to our reporter, and he has put them out. And Amnesty International also chronicled what has happened.
I'm sorry, but I think that's a bit naive. When you walk into a totalitarian government where people have injuries, how do you know that some of these injuries weren't caused, for example, by Hamas munitions? But can someone say that to a camera from Channel 4?
Mr. Regev, you are now saying that the people in Gaza... It is not the Israelis who dropped the phosphorus and the fragmentation bombs. It is Hamas. Is that right? Is that your allegation?
If you let me make my point, I'll make it very sanely. First of all, I said we're investigating our use of munitions, but you do know that Hamas also uses phosphorus weapons, and they shot them at Israel. That's a documented fact. And I think you should be very careful when you ever, in any journalistic situation, when you interview people who live in an authoritarian regime, you know there are limitations on what they can say.
Mr. Regev, with the greatest respect...
Can someone, I'd ask you, sir, can someone living in Gaza say something critical of Channel 4 and not pay to say something critical, to Channel 4 about Hamas,
Mr. Regev,
and be there tomorrow to answer another question?
Was Hamas democratically elected just a couple of years ago?
Correct, and then they took over a military coup and they ruled Gaza by terror. Ask Amnesty International.
You know, you could clear all this up by just signing up to Protocol 1 of the Geneva Convention, and then you'd be completely in the clear because you'd be abiding by it. But you refuse to do so. Why?
So do so many NATO members and democratic countries like India, because there are severe problems with that first protocol. We have, of course, signed up to the Geneva Convention, but there are many democratic countries who refuse to do so precisely because the first protocol blurs the distinction between combatant and non-combatant, a distinction that is so important.
Mr. Regev, I need to clarify this tonight, because clearly the evidence you're giving us must be given to the war crimes investigations that are being carried out in Gaza. You are saying that our evidence of flashettes, of phosphorus bombs, of fragmentation bombs, of shells that hit balconies and then spewed shrapnel around the walls, these things were done not by Israel, but by Hamas, correct?
I did not say that whatsoever, sir. You're putting words in my mouth. All I said was any objective journalistic or otherwise investigation is extremely difficult to do in a situation where people are not free to give evidence of what they saw.
Mr. Regev, I can assure you that Mr. Miller has been in very many conflicts, Congo and many others, and is extremely experienced and has moved perfectly freely around that territory. There is no question of his having been strong-armed by Hamas, or indeed the people that he has spoken to having been strong-armed by Hamas. As you well know, Hamas is virtually in hiding when it comes to these situations.
Not anymore. They came out since the fighting started, and they've been taking their revenge very strongly against their political opponents, as we've been documented. But can Mr. Miller walk down the street in Syria and ask people, do they like President Assad? What will they say? If he walks down the street in North Korea, do you like President Kim? What will people say?
Mr.
Hamas is an authoritarian regime.
Jonathan Miller is not in North Korea. Jonathan Miller is not in Syria. He is in Gaza. And he has reported
an authoritarian regime, sir.
Heinous.
A very authoritarian regime.
He has
a very authoritarian regime. Do you deny that Gaza has an authoritarian regime?
I'm grateful to you for joining us.